Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Thylacine Research Unit's latest podcast. Tonight, we're going to be discussing cloning the thylacine, de-extinction, and rewilding. My name's Warren Darren. With me tonight, I have Bill Flowers and Chris Copeland. Guys, how have you been over the last week?
I'm still alive.
Yeah.
I'm actually more awesome than I was last week.
It's something I find hard to believe, Bill. How could you possibly be even more awesome than what you were last week?
My beard's grown a bit more.
I guess good point, well made. And Chris, you're sounding a little bit down there that you're just alive.
Well, same week. Rain, sleet, frost. Cracker.
So typical day in Tasmania then.
Yes, typical day
It's pretty hard. Yeah, I was going to say it's very hard for the beardless.
Face gets cold. So, guys, yet again, another cracking response to our podcast from last week. A lot of really positive comments. A lot of people actually posting follow-up research of their own. Have you had a chance to have a look at it?
Yeah, I've had a good old read. I thought the most poignant comment on our Facebook page this week was from Paula K. Cherbuck. Sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. Hi, do you have an online shop? I'd love to support your team by wearing a t-shirt.
Well, awesome. So what's the answer to that, Chris? Do we have an online shop that sells T-shirts?
No, but we'll look into it, Paula, because I think it's a damn good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that reminds us of the fact that people can support our efforts in terms of trying to find the thylacine by going to our website. That's got a lot of things on all things thylacine at www.thylacineresearchunit.org. Got lots of material there to learn about the thylacine, to learn about a little bit about us, and you can also donate to our cause that will help not only continue this podcast but also our investigations into the field. And you can also see links up there to these podcasts. And remember that we are on iTunes, YouTube as well. So please subscribe to both our YouTube site and to our podcast on iTunes.
How is the podcast going, Warren? After all the work you put into get it up to iTunes to sort of give people the ability to use that and a few third-party characters, how is it going?
Yeah, look, it's going really well, and I think you can see that both through the Facebook reach stats that we have, and also the stats on the actual hosting site itself. I've been really, really pleased and surprised that people who probably haven't had an exposure to the thylacine and certainly our work in the past have been getting access through that service. So yeah, it's going really well. Each episode, the number of downloads increases. So thanks for listening, people, and keep listening. We've got lots of material to cover.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Okay, so let's get on with tonight's episode: cloning the thylacine, de-extinction, and rewilding. So
the big one.
It's a big one. It's a pretty topical issue, and when you look at the topic itself, we've really divided it into three sort of sections, and we'll talk about each of them as we go along. The first one is actually cloning the thylacine, and then we'll talk about de-extinction, and finally about rewilding or reintroducing any cloned thylacine back into a habitat.
Yep.
So, Chris, what do you know about the efforts of cloning the thylacine?
Well, it's an amazing sort of research program that's been going on for quite a few years. I do believe it's actually been axed now, hasn't it? But the attempt was to take some DNA from thylacine specimens, particularly the pups that are in the jars in the vault that we've seen, boys, and sort of extract that DNA, sequence it, and then use it to create a viable thylacine fetus.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that's a really good point. I think that there's a couple of documentaries about cloning the thylacine and the process that was being going through. But my understanding is that process is actually on hold at the moment. Bill, what's your knowledge of the thylacine cloning experiments?
Well, only what I've read and what I've seen, and yeah, it would seem that we're not there yet as far as technology goes, and yet I'm old enough to sort of see a lot of science fiction come to reality in my life. I've seen the space race and the rise of computers, so I wouldn't be surprised at all if down the track sometime they do have the technology to do this.
Sorry, I
Uh,
just facepalmed there and was just hoping we're not going to see the Skynet battle of T2.
Yeah, I was actually thinking
everything comes
of
to
asking Bill about what dinosaurs were like
Yeah.
face to face, but I thought I wouldn't go there. But
I
saw
did.
it this morning, actually.
so when I did a bit of research into the program that was put together by Professor Michael Archer, one of the things that I did come across was that there was a reasonable amount of criticism from the broader scientific community about his efforts, and a lot of that seemed to be around that there was a lot of media attention to it in terms of there's a press announcement and this is the end of extinction as we know it. And then we had the documentaries that I think pretty much every thylacine enthusiast would have seen. Chris, as a scientist and a zoologist, what's your view on that?
I don't particularly have a problem with the sort of ethics of what's going on or anything like that. I think it's quite exciting. I think he might have just made the classic mistake of just jumping the gun and sort of creating the media storm before he did the program rather than after he made the findings.
Mm. Bill, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I'd agree with Chris. It's so I, it's a dodgy thing, sort of going to the public with ideas, and I, I don't really. So I don't see there being really ethical problem with it at all.
I think it's
I
actually
mean,
pretty exciting, the sort of the culmination of a lot of different technologies and genetics coming together. But sort of realistically, to my understanding, the DNA that they got was pretty fragmented and was potentially not going to work for what they were after. But if you followed the mass media and the documentaries, you'd think he'd done it yesterday.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that comes to mind when I sort of think about this type of stuff, it's more the fact that these types of organisations, they don't necessarily get the government funding or even the private funding that they once did, and so as a result, many of them are expected to run like businesses. And one of the ways that you run a business is you market your ideas and whatnot. So I guess I personally would be a little bit sort of forgiving of the approach in terms of that attention could, I guess, attract sponsorship and people who are interested in the program so that they can actually get the funds to actually make their vision a reality.
Exactly, but you don't rock up to a drag strip saying that I've got a car that runs nines and pull out a Datsun 120Y or something, which is sort of like metaphorically what he did.
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, but
So
isn't he just sort of getting there and saying that, but maybe one day we can, and we're sort of heading in that direction? He's just sort of talking about possibilities.
Like I understand the sort of competitiveness for grant funding and things like that, but no disrespect, he seems to be one of the most passionate advocates for the thylacine. But yeah, I still think that maybe the sort of the announcement came a little bit early.
yeah, and I think my reading of the announcement was that he was very confident that they were going to crack this particular nut, and I think when you think that it was 1999 that he made that announcement, 16 years ago, that's a fair time, and I guess then they sort of tended to have issues with the actual quality of the DNA. And one of the critiques that I read was that for a long time, they were actually going about sequencing the DNA of bacteria that they actually had harvested from the organs rather than the DNA of the thylacine itself. So
Yeah.
some pretty fundamental sorts of errors there.
Well, was it error though? Like, sort of ultimately, when those specimens were collected, they were certainly not done sort of today's standard. So, I mean, there was always going to be some contamination, and even like professionals these days still end up with hair or skin cells and things like that within their samples. So, I'm not sure if that was maybe a little bit too harsh considering what he was working with.
Yeah. Look, and I think that's probably one of the other things that we've sort of discovered through our sort of research, and there we are in the vaults of the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, and we're talking about and looking at the pickled pups in the jar, and
just might need to backtrack there, Warren, and just sort of tell people that we've been into the vault.
Yeah, look, I think, and I guess we often talk about it as if people know, but we've been fortunate through our work with our upcoming TV project to get access to places that many people could only dream about, and we were able to spend quite a bit of time in places where people don't get to go, and a lot of that was because of Bill's rugged looks that we were able to charm the good Catherine Medlock. I think I recall seeing starry eyes from her part when she looked upon the magnificence that was Bill.
Hang on a sec, I'll just call our lawyers.
It was the beard.
It was the beard. Yeah,
It's the beard.
it was the beard. But as a result of that, and I think Chris, you in particular, got to talk to her and interview her at great length about all of the specimens there, and that's when she sort of let a bit of a clangor go. And as far as we were concerned, I guess it's probably more broadly known by the people who are closer to this, that it wasn't actually the thylacine pup DNA that was used or the most usable in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely, and sort of some of the stories about how they extracted that DNA and sort of one of those samples being nearly destroyed and things. It was quite an extraordinary conversation.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely when you hear other stories about specimens being sent to other research institutions, and they're basically putting these quite valuable specimens in a blender to actually do it. You think, okay, quite a destructive process, but
Yeah.
I think the upshot of all of that was that a lot of the most usable DNA actually came from skin remnants or from skulls that they had, rather than from the actual pickled pups themselves.
For sure, and that sort of like been able to extract the DNA from the base of teeth and sort of from the bone of that skull. Like, it was pretty extraordinary conversation, absolutely.
Mm, mm. And can you confirm that Bill was quite charming throughout that whole time?
I can neither confirm or deny.
Yeah, I kind of remember waiting in the corridor in disgust as Bill tried to flutter his eyelids, but
God, hang on, I just need a drink.
What can I say, guys? When you've got it, you got it. You got a beard, you got to flaunt it.
yeah.
Sorry, I'll have, cappuccino, white, 2. Thanks, mate.
Yeah.
Sorry, I thought you just mentioned beard and I just automatically thought barista.
Yeah. Cappuccino.
Yeah.
Okay. So just sort of changing tack a little bit. How about the whole concept about should we, this regardless of the quality of the DNA that's available out there, or whether the technology exists, should we actually clone the thylacine anyway? So if assuming there is DNA, there is the technology, should we clone the thylacine? What do you reckon, Bill?
Yes. Yeah, I think we should. If it is extinct, and we certainly pushed it that way. We sort of have the moral obligation to clone it. But then we also have the other problem is once you've cloned it, what do you do with it?
Mm. Chris, what do you think? Should we clone the thylacine?
That's a difficult one. Like, should we clone the thylacine? I think, like anyone, I'd love to see a living thylacine specimen. Like, sort of, as much as it pains me, I think I might actually agree with Bill there. Like, yes, possibly, sort of to clone a thylacine would be awesome, but what do you do with it? I mean, you can't, in my opinion, establish a viable population of thylacine from clones. I mean, they're literally twins of one another.
Yeah.
And so, if you want a viable sort of functional population, I don't believe you can do it by clones. Ultimately, sort of, you have no genetic variation. You'll have no sort of genetic strength, vigor. You'll potentially have an exaggerated susceptibility to disease, inbreeding, depression. It's going to be fraught with issues. Like one's awesome, two's maybe not the basis of a population.
Yeah.
I don't know if
So
you... Sorry.
I was just going to say you've raised a couple of really good points there. So study into other marsupial carnivores, in particular the devil, has shown a low degree of genetic diversity with the devils, and it's believed that thylacines are the same. So one of the concerns that I think would exist is that, given the fact that whilst the bounty scheme and hunting by man and pressure on habitat certainly pushed the thylacine over the edge, it was also reported that they were suffering from a distemper type disease. So it could actually be very possible that you actually bring one of these animals back to life and it's still susceptible to that particular disease, isn't it?
Yeah, very much. And the problem that devils have is not only a lack of genetic variation, but a lack of MHC variants. So they're, for want of a better analogy, they're immune system twins of one another. So sort of ultimately you've got this exaggerated susceptibility to devil facial tumour disease that's actually a graft of a full cancer cell that they can't recognise and mount an immune response. I mean, it's an extraordinarily complicated and unusual problem because of a lack of genetic variation. And sort of when devil facial tumour disease kicked into play in '96, there was about 200,000 odd devils in the state, and unfortunately they were very common, but from such a narrow genetic base that they are sort of really exaggerated into their susceptibility to disease. And if you go and clone the thylacine, you're going to have small numbers with no variants. It's going to be a minefield for problems like that.
Mm. So let's just assume that there is a small remnant population of thylacines out there.
Okay, before we go there, are you talking functional or functionally extinct? Because I think this is a real big issue that we've got to sort of maybe talk about before we go down the line of your conversation.
Yeah, well, I'm saying, I guess, if we assume that they are, I guess, functionally extinct, so we're saying that there is a small number out there, but in such low numbers that they can't sustain themselves, so they're pushing themselves towards complete extinction.
And functional extinction is sort of an animal population that's below its critical mass. It can't hold a grip on a niche. It's sort of it's there, but it's not a viable number. And to banter a few numbers around, like pre-European, they estimate that the devil population was about 100,000. Post-European, at points it was up over 200,000, but it had fluctuated really dramatically, and that's potentially the genetic bottlenecking that may have broke the devil's back. They're talking critical mass of devil is about 10,000 animals with 150 founders in it, which is a significant number. So in theory, if you go down to 9,000 animals, you're functionally extinct. So you're not going to get a recovery from 0. You're not going to get a recovery from 2. You've got to have 10,000 animals. 9,999 in theory is not enough. So, I mean, for Thylacine, they were talking 5,000 individuals. Correct me if I'm wrong. So, sort of 10% of that, that's 500 animals. Is there a genetically viable, functional population of over 500 thylacine in Tasmania? I'd have to say probably not. Is there a functionally extinct population? Who knows? And I think that's what we're all trying to sort of understand and investigate. But the lower you go below that critical mass, the more genetic issues, the more sort of bottlenecking and sort of susceptibility to disease and inbreeding depression that you're potentially going to get.
Yeah, and I guess the whole thing with functional extinction is that even if a species is functionally extinct, you would still expect that you would have evidence of them still existing out there. There'd be the occasional verified sighting. One would walk across a game trail camera. So that's certainly the case with other functionally extinct animals.
For sure, and there's probably the most famous functionally extinct animal species, something like the Californian condor, which came down to 8 known individuals. They had to trap them all up, and now there's known to be 22, and they are starting to release them back into the wild. Like, you can go to very low numbers, but sort of ultimately it's a tremendous amount of work for recovery.
So I guess that goes into a nice segue of where I was going before until you pulled me up.
I'll invoice you for that segue.
Thank you kindly, sir. So could cloning supplement this genetically depleted, functionally extinct population that's still out in the wild? So could we use that extra genetic diversity that may exist in all of these specimens that are in museum vaults all over the world? You know, there'd be at least several hundred specimens spread across the world to actually bolster the population.
You going, Bill?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, I was sort of wondering if it would have any negative effect on the population at all. It depends on what quality of thylacine you can clone. Is it going to be exactly the same animal?
That's going to sort of border on a point I wanted to bring up down the track about the passenger pigeon down the track. But to answer your question, Warren, no, I don't think so. Like, I don't know if you can sort of increase genetic viability and variation anywhere near as much as what people may imagine. Like, it's very, very difficult. You can't really create something out of nothing. You can't pull a genetic rabbit out of a hat, so to speak, easily.
And that's despite the fact there may be 10 or 11 generations difference between the thylacine in the bottle versus the one that's struggling to hold on in the wilderness somewhere.
Yeah, but what's the degree of relatedness of those specimens in the bottle? What was the sort of level of variance in the population anyway? There's a lot of, in my opinion, there's a lot of factors that have to be sort of addressed.
So
you can't, like, to put it bluntly, and I know we've got a sort of a clean rating on iTunes, so I'll tread carefully, but I mean, I don't think you can create a viable population from twins. I mean, if you had a twin, would you be attracted to reproduce with it? Would you even recognise one another as viable partners? Things like that. I just don't think that there's potentially enough variability in the specimens to maybe get this viable population going. Is there the ability to and the technology to get a thylacine, maybe a viable sort of population? I don't know.
We're talking science fiction here at the moment.
Are we?
Well, yeah, I mean, because we haven't created the thylacine yet, so obviously it's science fiction.
I don't know if I agree. Hey,
Yeah. Well, we do have a number of other, I guess, de-extinction or cloning research programs that are happening around the world. Chris, what other cloning programs are you aware of?
there's one here. The Pyrenean ibex springs to mind, and it's an incredibly tragic tale, of very similar to the thylacine, about basically this ibex was shot to extinction. And from what I can read, they have sort of made massive inroads into actually bringing this animal back. There's the work on the passenger pigeon, the famous gastric brooding frog that Mike Archer also worked on. I don't know if science fiction is really what's going on here. Like, science fiction for me is some idiot in a blue phone box zipping around the multiverse. This is science reality, but have we got a thylacine in our hot little hand? No. Are we sort of capable of it in the near future? Possibly, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, but that's science fiction because it's a scientific idea which hasn't happened yet, and we're now talking about possibilities that maybe it could. But what I was going to go to is...
I just got away with calling Doctor Who a git, too.
Who?
Who?
What? Yeah. Is that a TV show, is it?
I don't know. I think it was some dude that Jax Teller shot in season 1, wasn't it?
I think I'm about to leave the room.
Yeah, all the Star
Trek. What I was going to say is if we stretch science fiction a bit further, what would happen if they had the ability to clone 1,000 thylacines each year and drop them into the wild constantly?
That'd be 1,000 twins.
Yeah. Well, we're not talking normal reproduction. We're talking about we're now populating the wild with the same animal, but there's so many of them that they start becoming functional as their role in the ecosystem. And occasionally they might breed, but because they're not really breeding and it's not very successful, we keep popping in another 1,000 thylacines each year.
So as anything's possible, you've got 2 kids, so...
You haven't got any sources.
Point taken. I see your point.
Yeah, the Copelands are functionally extinct. Yeah, okay, I see the parallel.
Yeah.
I guess the other question that I have is in relation to the genetic varieties. If science is advanced enough to actually clone these animals, is it then possible that they could actually engineer that genetic variety?
Yeah, this is probably the difficult question. And this is where it sort of maybe brings in those parallels that everyone wants to bring in about Jurassic Park and things like that. And you sort of have to ask the question: if you're sort of engineering, is the animal that you're actually releasing a thylacine? And that's sort of what I wanted to talk about a little bit with the passenger pigeon, is that they've sort of the idea is to sort of tweak and bring in this and bring in that, and sort of the end result might look like that species, but is it actually that species?
Well, that's I guess a really good point, because when you look at what animal is actually going to carry the thylacine to term, what amount of the DNA of the host animal or the mother is actually going into that particular animal is also an interesting point in terms of, it might be 95% thylacine, but is it 5% spotted tail quoll, for example?
I think this is where you're going to win a bit, because you're dealing with marsupials, not placentals.
Yeah.
Like the gestational period of a devil's 21 days. That it doesn't embed fully into the uterine wall, etc. It's a non-placental animal. A marsupial doesn't necessarily have to have a pouch, and there's a few primitive marsupials left in the same family of devil and a few in South America that don't actually have pouches. It's that lack of placental connection. So in direct response to what you said, I think you're going to win there a bit that actually it is marsupial, and if you can sort of develop that fetus and then put it into a surrogate pouch, you're potentially not going to have that problem that you mentioned. But the problem that you are going to have is that there's no thylacines and no thylacine pouches to utilise. What are you going to use as that surrogate? With devils and quolls, we have to hand raise orphans and things, basically because one individual female won't accept another individual's young, and why should she? They're not her genetic line. It makes no real biological sense out there in quoll and devil land to raise another genetic lineage, and these are some of the more closely related species we've got left to thylacine. So what are you actually going to use to raise this fetus? Devil stay in the pouch for 6 months. Thylacine was bigger animal, so it's probably a longer time frame in the pouch. That's a long time to be hand raising something with the technology we've got.
Well, I guess that that leads to the whole nature versus nurture discussion too, in terms of saying when it does go to reintroducing one of these animals to the wild, how much of its behaviour is hard coded into its DNA versus how much is it learning from mum and dad about how to hunt and do all those sorts of things.
Jeez, that's a good question. Do you want to go, Bill, or can I jump in here and rant?
Yeah, from my experience, the herbivores, the solitary herbivores, they just go off and they just do their thing. They seem to learn it anyway. With carnivores, though, it's probably a bit of a different kettle of fish because I think devils do learn stuff off their carers. I think captive devils do act a bit different from wild devils.
For sure, but in my experience of working with devils, they are relatively easy animals to release because they're not social, so you're not trying to get them into someone else's pack or family unit or clan or whatever. They're not territorial, and they're real hard-coded with some fairly intense, raw instinct. And so a few times, like when people ask, like, their instinct to hunt, to me, seems about as strong as my instinct to breathe. You don't need to teach a devil to hunt. It's hard-coded into that animal. But
Yeah,
I take Bill's point, absolutely. The younger you receive an orphan devil, the more conditioning it gets to people, the more differently it behaves, absolutely, to a point where people can screw up that animal's instinct and it won't breed, it won't release successfully because they sort of don't draw back their contact.
And they become overly reliant on, particularly their source of food. And I think it's something that you see all the time in places that have high tourists, mostly with the herbivores and the like, in terms of making sure that you don't feed the local animals.
Speaking of,
so there's thylacines in the background there.
I haven't released that guy yet.
It's quiet on the down low. I think with sort of something like a devil, what you do is remove a lot of its natural timidity towards people. Like, a devil couldn't be a more timid animal, and then a hand-raised devil is often so heavily conditioned to people it's very aggressive. Particularly the male. So, I mean, you are going to have behavioural issues, and particularly because you can't observe what goes on, because we don't have thylacine documented on how they raise their young particularly well and things like that. It's going to be a lot of trial and error, and you're potentially going to end up with a lot of poorly animals that can't be released sort of within the process for sure.
I I would imagine though, if you was to do this, you'd have to start off. The first few generations would have to be in zoos, and just because of the management issues and breeding issues and things like that, you'd have to start them off in zoos for a few generations before you think about releasing in the wild, I'd think.
Yeah.
And
And then
so that stage, the ones that you are going to release in the wild, they're going to be more hands off.
Okay, Jen. So let's just imagine for a second that that I'm the head of a government clandestine unit that's gone out and cloned the thylacine.
so sorry, I'm just imagining you leading a government unit.
That's right. Yes,
Sorry,
yes.
continue. Yep.
So continue, and I've got a few thylacines that I've been cloning, and I want to release them in the wild because it's part of an election promise to put these back out into the wilderness. So I approach Chris Copeland, who's well known in the marsupial carnivore field in Tasmania. 15 years experience working with these marsupial carnivores in a variety of locations. And I say, Chris, I've got a bunch of thylacines. I need to release them in the wild. How are you going to do it?
Right.
Just to backtrack there a bit, first, the Tasmanian government would try to do it all themselves, and it's only after they fail they go and talk to Chris.
Okay, let's just say that that's already happened. They've eaten their humble pie, and now they've made the long drive up to Cradle Mountain, and they've enticed Chris into a cafe with a chai latte, and they put this proposition to him. What are you going to do, Chris?
Right. I think it'd have to be a multiple pronged approach. I don't love the idea of introducing predatory species to islands in Tasmania because none of those islands support them naturally. So my first sort of idea would have to be peninsula, where you can control the inflow and outflow and sort of have a sort of natural habitat fenced off that used to support marsupial carnivores. From there, I think you'd have to do some fairly heavy feral animal eradication to try and ease back the pressure on the niche that the thylacine would have to fulfill. And then from there, I think you'd have to soft release rather than hard release. I think if you've raised these animals from fetal stage rather than sort of a fully furred orphan or something, you're going to have to sort of let them come and go backward and forward from a demountable enclosure to adapt and acclimate and acclimatise to the wild environment. From there, I think you'd have to collar certain individuals so that you could understand their range, their spatial usage, their dispersion, their proximity to one another, answer the question of whether they're social or solitary, all those sorts of things, and sort of utilise that to try and go better in the next generation and better in the next generation.
Bill, so you came out with the first fleet. You've got 147 years experience working with marsupial carnivores yourself.
Yeah.
What would you add to Chris's plan?
I think Chris's plan's pretty solid. It's very similar to what they're doing on Maria Island. The only difference is Maria Island, they probably shouldn't have put Tasmanian devils there. But the interesting thing is Maria Island was always earmarked to put thylacines there anyway.
I agree 100%. You're dead on. But, I mean, it's barely big enough to maintain a devil population. I don't see it being large enough land mass to actually get a thylacine population. And a few figures I've kicked around in my head, a thylacine would probably have to have a range of maybe 150 square k. It's a big area.
Well, yeah, but any animal's territory or a range is based on the availability of food. If they've got plenty of food, they're not going to have as big a range as if their food is scarce.
For sure, but with
Food
Thylacine territorial, I mean, you've got your defined territory, your defended territory, and then you've got an animal's range, and the range is always bigger than territory. Devils aren't territorial. Sorry?
Or did they migrate from one side of the state to the other?
Exactly.
That's the other question. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think it'd take a few generations of trying to sort of understand so that you could, because you don't have that backlog of data to call upon, so you're going to have to start pretty much from scratch.
I think if you had a place like Maria Island, and I'm only even mentioning this is because Eric Geiler mentioned it. What you've basically got is a large park or a large zoo.
Mm-hmm.
You still have to control that population. And to be fair to the devil, thing is they are now capturing animals and taking them off the island.
Yes, and a few calcitrant animals too that are sort of too confident around people, which was probably always going to happen.
Oh yeah, I've seen them. Being on the island, I've seen it. Yeah, they are basically living underneath the shacks and things.
Mm-hmm.
But then also with that, we saw with Mariah, we see a big impact on the penguins. When I was there, I'd say about 90% of the droppings had penguin feathers in them.
Yeah.
So, yeah, if you're looking at, like you were saying before, probably Peninsula would be much better because,
I think, my personal opinion is that the Thylacine would have had to have been the top order predator of Tasmania, and just maximum 5,000 individuals compared to say 100,000 devils and things like that, 3.5 times bigger than a devil. I'm sort of in my head, the Thylacine was the top order predator, devil the second order predator, something like Eastern Quoll tertiary, and sort of it's gonna need a slightly different sort of approach because it's a top order predator. What are your views, Warren?
Yeah, look, I agree, and I think that the whole would Tasmania itself actually be the best place to rewild these animals? Would you be better off actually putting them instead of a Tasmanian island, not enough land mass, not enough prey species? You couldn't put enough of a viable population on those small islands. Would you be better off taking it to somewhere in the mainland and rewilding them there?
I don't know, but I mean, Tasmania was its last known habitat. The genetics of those animals that they would most likely be drawing the DNA from would be regional adapted to Tasmania. Tasmania's got a bazillion. I've heard estimates of up to 15 million paddy melons currently. I don't think there's any shortage of space. I don't think there's any shortage of prey. Sorry.
I guess one of the things that just sort of jumps into my mind from listening to some of the maths that you're talking about there, and I'll have to do this without the aid of a spreadsheet, so it might be a little bit fast and loose. But let's just say, so you quoted, say, a maximum population of 5,000 animals. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that we halve that number and say it's 2,500 as the apex predator.
Yep.
Over the 29-year period of the bounties, there were 2,208 or so thylacines killed. So, that's, not even the total population that would have been around in any 1 year.
Yep.
So that sort of says that it's not just the bounty and the hunting itself that actually wipe these animals out. And I think the records show that probably in any 1 year, if, again, we've halved the maximum number to 2,500, that you're looking at about 200 to 300, so maximum of 10% of the population taken in any one year of the bounties, and in the latter years, hardly any. That kind of, again, points to things like disease taking hold and those sorts of things. So, would thylacines have all died out because of the disease? Or B, if you are reintroducing them, is that disease still lying out there dormant, ready to take them again?
It depends on what the disease was. I think a point to bring up before we go there is that if you had, say, 2,500 individuals, not all 2,500 of those animals would actually be the breeding population. So if you had, like, just to make some maths easier, if you had 100 thylacines, probably 50 of, or if it was 100 devils, 50 would be male, 50 would be female, but you'd probably only have 75 sort of like viable pairs and things like that. Not every individual is going to be able to breed within that 100 base population. Yep. So sort of from there, how many young do they have? What was the attrition rate of the young? The population was probably only self-sustaining naturally. Like, predators don't tend to sort of, you can't support an infinite number of predators in any given area. They boom and bust a little bit naturally, but there is a finite number that you can support because you need all that prey and all of that space.
Yeah, so I guess, that's the potential argument to sit there and say that if the population, or the bounty scheme was particularly targeting those who are in the breeding age, so the ones who are either too young or too old were missed, so you got those who are right in that peak period. If that's then also affected by the disease, you're definitely going to push yourself over the edge.
For sure, and that was the point I was getting at. Extinction's usually a combined factor of events, and extinction's not usually a single factor. So even like a dirty, great big meteorite colliding with the Earth near Mexico 65 million years ago, single-handedly didn't kill every individual dinosaur or anything dramatic like that. It sort of just unleashed a chain reaction of events. So the bounty scheme would have been the primary cause of decline for thylacine, as devil facial tumour disease is currently for devil. But then, as you said, Warren, it does indicate that other factors took over, and in my opinion, those other factors would have been genetic fragmentation, as one population couldn't flow into another population because you had roads and agriculture and towns and infrastructure built. So you automatically created subcritical groups that would then begin to inbreed and become more susceptible to disease. All those factors play into it.
For sure. Guys, so why don't we just head over and have a look at the questions and comments on the Facebook page as they relate to this particular episode.
Yep.
So do we want to pick one out? How about old Brigo? I tend to think it would be much nicer if thylacine was still extant and awaiting ethical discovery, and like Cole Bailey's comments about why bring back thylacine through genetics when they still exist. However, I'm open-minded about the project working on this, and I've seen Mike Archer interviewed on the subject, found him earnest and passionate about the idea of bringing the tiger back. On the whole, I hope they exist and are rediscovered by the right people with an eye to ethical conservation of their future well-being. So that's from Steve Brigginshaw or Brigo.
Yeah, I like this comment from Rick Van Midden. I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, but I romanticise about thylacines being reintroduced like the wolves at Yellowstone. Also, I can't say how this would functionally work, bringing them back through cloning. How would the thylacine cope? Would have no thylacines to learn from what to hunt. Hybrid vigour he talks about. It's sort of missing a few lines. What a day it would be if we find a small populations of thylacine I have my doubts, but welcome that day that proves otherwise. I think in one 10-line comment, he's probably wrapped up our entire hour that we've spoken about. I think,
for sure.
like, one comment that keeps reoccurring from a number of different posters here is, what if they're not extinct? What if they're still present? But I still always think that it comes back to that. Is it an viable population, or is it a functionally extinct population?
Yeah. So there's a comment here from Shella. There are thylacines roaming the mainland, so why clone them? No one knows what to feed them as diet changes every 2 to 3 weeks. Pouch time is unknown, as is growth rate, especially if you believe that thylas are full grown at 9 months and independent of their mother. How many Dolly the sheep were produced until Dolly actually lived for a few years with a load of ailments?
Yeah, I mean, like, when we hand raise devils and things like that, the consistency of the milk does need to change, etc. Because the fat content, the protein content, and things like that changes fairly consistently, if that's what she's getting at.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, yeah, like, if this is going to occur, you're not going to go from DNA to viable population in one generation. Bam, problem solved.
Yeah. And Angela Jones, cloning equals Pet Cemetery by Stephen King. They are back, but they aren't quite right.
Cracker of a book.
Yeah. and, then following on from that, also huge ethical concerns around cruelty towards practice animals, surrogates, donors, and non-viable products of conception, deformed or unwell offspring.
Yeah, it's potentially sort of a contentious issue there. I don't think you're ever going to get everyone agreeing on sort of husbandry practices and laboratory practices and things like that. But realistically, what we're talking about will require a lot of laboratory practice, and people aren't going to agree with that. So
Yeah.
I think she's got a real viable point, a real contentious point.
Another interesting point that might come out of what she's saying is how ethical is it for the well-being of a Tasmanian devil mother to raise a thylacine?
I don't think it would, mate. I just don't think that personally enters into it. I cannot see a devil raising a thylacine young.
Okay.
I mean, a devil won't raise a surrogate devil offspring from another female. Why would it raise an animal that's in a different genus?
I have actually seen devil mother still young off another devil mother.
Yeah, I've seen that
And
too,
she's
where the
tried to
young get mixed up
sort of-
because they're sharing a den and stuff, but it's a little bit different to sort of implanting a fetus into the pouch of. I think that's going to be that's always been the problem that I've had with this plan, is that if you can produce this fetus, how are you going to raise it?
Yeah. And devil's milk was not like thylacine milk, and the young's probably not going to be that strong. And we all know how it is for a young devil to survive anyway.
I have the answer.
Uh,
Cascade Premium Light, because it's got a thylacine on the bottle.
Boom, there you go.
Boom! Patented.
So
Can I just bring up one point before you move on, Warren?
you can.
Pronunciation could be incorrect here, and I apologise in advance. The dude's name is Christian Mitch. I believe he's from Germany or the likes. And he's concerned... Oh, he apologises for his English. Yes, he's from Germany. It's just written here. I think that there are many people who will hunt the tigers if they're released. What do you think about that point? I don't think, personally, that would be a massive issue in this day and age. That might be contentious, and we might get a few comments there, but what do you guys think?
in my long experience, I say never underestimate the stupidity of humans.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah. Look, I think it is a good point in some ways. We've obviously been out looking for thylacines in the field, and we have come across the remnants of hunters shooting and shotgun cartridges and those sorts of things. So there are people obviously out there hunting,
but not everyone that owns a gun, or a very, very, very small percentage of people that own guns, it's out there causing trouble. Like, just because you've got a gun and a four-wheel drive doesn't make you an idiot.
Absolutely, and I think what I was going to suggest is that there is a low propensity of firearm ownership in Australia in comparison to, say, the United States, for example. So, whilst there might be a lot of rural properties that have weapons and those sorts of things, it's not. Not every household has a weapon. Not everybody's going to go out there and actually be looking to hunt these things. And more importantly, I guess I would imagine it would be very, very difficult for someone to come in from, say, overseas who wanted to bag themselves a thylacine to actually arrange for that to happen. So just because of the very tight weapons licensing laws in Australia to start with. So how are you going to arrange that? I mean, I'm sure it would be possible, but it would be very, very difficult.
Well, it'd be hard. Johnny Depp's dog.
Well, that's right. Yeah, there you go.
Let's not go there.
We rest our case.
Yeah.
So I guess one point that hasn't been mentioned, but it was certainly part of the discussion. You might recall some time ago, Dr. Glenn Chilton, who's written a number of books on extinct animals. I had a bit of a chat with him over a few beers, and he basically made the point to me that even if it was technically possible to clone a thylacine, he didn't think it was ethically right to do so. And the reason he gave was that basically the amount of money that it would take to successfully clone thylacine into a viable population, you'd be far better off investing that into other animals that were endangered, because you'd get a far better return on that investment in comparison to trying to bring back an animal that, for whatever reason, whether it was man's intervention or because of nature, had ceased to exist. So what do you think about that point?
I think it's a real viable point. Like, if you're going to sink a bazillion into trying to clone the thylacine, where that's money is going to come from, extant species going to suffer, would it not be better to invest that money in devil recovery? Quoll recovery?
I think the problem there is that you're thinking too logical. Thylacines are sexy. People probably chuck money at it if there's money to be thrown at it.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I think that there is still this whole underpinning feeling of guilt in relation to the thylacine and other animals that I guess mankind has pushed to extinction, that it's a wrong that people want to right, I guess.
Sure, the thylacine's an enigma, absolutely. And when I first came out of uni, and I've said this story before, and Bill and I talk about it all the time, but when I first came out of uni and started working with devils, like everyone would ask about thylacine. The recognition of thylacine is probably actually greater globally, in my experience, than it is actually devil. And so it is an enigma, and you're dead right. People potentially feel that guilt and want to right that wrong.
Okay, guys. Well, it's time to come up with a conclusion and to visit the skeptometer. So,
how are you going to skepto this?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So, I guess in your conclusion, do you think that we should clone the thylacine, and then do you think that it's going to be possible anytime in the near future in terms of the skeptometer and its likelihood of recreating a viable population? Christopher.
Okay. I think that cloning the thylacine, people, as we just talked about, people want to right that wrong. It will have potentially valuable repercussions for the management of other species. The technology that is pioneered for thylacine could hopefully be used for other species in the country and internationally. Do I think that it could create a viable population? Probably not. Do I think that it'll happen in my lifetime? Not sure. But I think we are making more and more advancements more rapidly, and the cost of it's coming down, and the length of my lifetime, it probably directly correlates to the amount of alcohol that I drink in my life.
Right, so give me a skeptometer reading on that one.
I'm stalling. You mean skepto reading of alcohol consumption in my life, or the thylacine?
On the thylacine, mate.
Jeez, can you? I'm going to need you to fire a direct question that I can
Will it happen
skepto.
in the next 50 years? How about that?
Will the thylacine
Be cloned in the next 50 years?
Will an individual thylacine be cloned in the next 50 years?
Yeah.
I'd probably be up around 40-50%. I think the advancements, we don't have it today, but I don't believe it's science fiction, as Bill mentioned. I think we're going to have the technology within my lifetime. Yes. Warren.
Okay, so well, I guess for my hard-earned Australian tax dollar, I'd say that hard-earned. That's what I laughed. That cloning of the thylacine is the best chance that we have for seeing a living and breathing thylacine. As much as I'd hope that there's a remnant population out there, I'd have to say the balance of probability suggests that they're not out there. So I would like to see the thylacines cloned. I think that some of that inherent lack of genetic variation or diversity that you'd expect to see there may actually be a greater help than it is a hindrance. Will we see a thylacine in the next 50 years? I was going to say my lifetime. I'll be 93 in 50 years. I would say on the skeptometer, I'd give it 7 out of 10.
Hey, this is the first time we've actually even gotten up there to those sorts of figures.
Yeah, no, look, I just think that, as you say, the technology is getting better and better.
And cheaper.
And cheaper, and they're using things like gaming theory to predict the next sequence and all those sorts of things. Yeah, I think it's going to happen. It's a question of when, not if.
And in some respects, it's bloody exciting. Some of that technology is really exciting.
Yeah,
Bill?
absolutely.
Yeah, when they do clone one, I'd like to take one out in the bush, put it in an enclosure, set cameras up all around it, so the remnant population is going to come around sniffing around and catch it on camera.
So in 50 years, you'll be 1,457.
That's right.
I may have had to regenerate a few times.
Yeah.
in that TARDIS of yours.
Yeah.
Yeah, after a few conflicts with Daleks or bureaucrats anyway. Yeah, because my experience of looking after animals is that animals attract animals. So if there were any thylacines out there and you had some in an enclosure, it would attract them. Well, anyway, that little fantasy aside.
Yep.
We don't want your fantasies on this podcast, Bill.
Well, it happens in the next 50 years. I won't be around in 50 years' time, I don't think. But, yeah, I'd say 6. 6 on the skeptometer.
So that's a 5, a 7, and a 6. So
Yep.
We're all saying that more than likely it's going to happen.
Yep.
That's a good possibility. It could happen, yeah.
Yeah, well, that's it's probably the only time we'll have that high rating. So
And it's the only time we're probably all going to agree to this degree of agreement.
that's right. So the standard deviation between our results is quite low. Okay, guys, well, that's pretty
Sorry,
much.
I just fell asleep as soon as you mentioned standard deviation.
I've got a formula for my spreadsheet that works it out for me straight away. Um, so that's the end of this particular podcast. But I just want to remind people of one thing. We obviously have a lot of reference material that we refer to in terms of Thylacine books. You can actually get access to those books through our website, again at www.thylacineresearchunit.org. It has links to the Amazon bookstore. If you click our link, we get a very small commission, a couple of percentage points on that. In fact, after we talked to Bob Paddle, and he told us that he gets about 50 cents from every book that he sells. I think we worked out that if someone buys a book from us, we actually might get more money from the book sale than he would. So that's pretty interesting. Good for us, sad for him. Podcast 5, Chris. What are we looking at doing for the next podcast next week?
We're going to analyse a Tasmanian-based Thylacine report from 2015. So we're going to go new school.
New school. So really exciting. People are quite often asking us about what sightings we have, and the 2015s or the recent ones that we're investigating, we pretty much don't throw those up on the website or on Facebook because we like to investigate those, and that's always about the protection of a potential animal that might be out there. So this one, we're going to give some details out without being super specific in terms of where exactly, but really interesting sighting, and really want to analyse it and run the Smith reporting scheme and talk about what on-site investigations happened, and let's hear what Bill has to say about it and all those sorts of things. So
sounds awesome.
Yeah.
Righto, guys. Well, look, thanks again, everybody, for listening in. We'll talk to you in a week or so. So see you later, guys.
Thought for the week. Your beer's not half empty. You're halfway on to your next one.
And my beard will be just that little bit longer.